director for our developmental disabilities program. So that's the program where I help support people. Georgia Advocacy Office is the independent federally mandated protection and advocacy system for Georgia. And what that means is that we are independent from the state system. We're our own nonprofit, and we're here to make sure that people are free from abuse and neglect, have access to the services and supports they need, and their human and civil rights are protected. We support people all across the state of Georgia with all sorts of disabilities in any age group. So the only real two criteria is that you have a disability and you live in Georgia. And so if folks are having trouble, you can contact us via any of those ways down the bottom of the slide. Our phone number, a 1-800 number, and you can email us for support. So we always talk a little bit about our vision and mission because it's really central to the work that we do, right? So we envision a Georgia where all people have value, visibility, and voice, and where even the most difficult and long-lasting challenges are addressed by ordinary citizens working on behalf of each other, and where the perception of disability is replaced by the recognition of ability. And we really talk about those relationships where people are working on behalf of each other, because that's the best protection and advocacy that folks can benefit from. I think we saw that a lot during the pandemic, right? When neighbors coming together to help make sure people had what they need and checking on each other. And I think as a society, we've gotten away from that a little bit in some places. And so really thinking about what it means to be in community and be in those relationships, we're able to get our needs met by working together with each other. And I think also during the pandemic, we saw some places where that wasn't true for people with disabilities, that folks had kind of been left out of that conversation or weren't in their neighborhoods to be able to benefit from that. And so all the work that we're doing, and we'll talk about the ways we do it, but ultimately our goal is to make sure that people are in their communities and in those sorts of relationships so they can really benefit from that protection. And then we organize our resources and follow our values and legal mandates in ways to substantially increase the number of people who are voluntarily standing beside and for Georgians who have significant disabilities and mental illness. So we're looking for ways always to bring ordinary citizens into that conversation. And whether it's working with people one-on-one or just using their voice, right? Having folks advocate on behalf of other people, including folks with disabilities and their issues is one of the ways in which we do our work. So these are our priorities, right? To protect people from abuse and neglect, to respond to allegations of discrimination and legal rights violations, and to promote integration and self-determination of people with disabilities in the community, right? So those things I mentioned before, that's what we're working towards in all the different ways we do that. We offer protection and advocacy services in a variety of different ways, right? For people who experience developmental disabilities, for folks who experience mental illness or traumatic brain injuries. We also work to help people get connected to assistive technology. Anyone experiencing a violation of their individual rights, no matter what their disability. We do work around voting, making sure that people have access to accessible, fair, equitable elections. We work to support people with access to their Social Security benefits, especially as it relates to work. And then there's a new program within our agency where folks who are receiving the services of a representative payee, someone else receives their Social Security benefits. We monitor those representative payees and offer support to people if they're being exploited or their rep payee just isn't really aware of what that program entails. And so that's part of the way in which we do the work, right? Those are the folks that we serve. And then we do that work, right, in a variety of ways. So we're always working to make sure people are free from abuse and neglect. So we investigate that. We provide information and referral. So that means folks, I like to say, if you know of a person with a disability in Georgia and they're stuck or something's not working right in their life, you can call our office and talk it through with someone. That's our information and referral service. We'll get you connected to some resources, even if it's not with us. We provide technical assistance, advice, and support in self-advocacy. So sometimes people just need to know what steps to take, right? I might really be able to work a problem out on my own, but I don't know who to call, or I don't know what state agency does that sort of thing. And so we want to get people connected to that. We provide assistance in advocacy, negotiation, or mediation on behalf of individuals. So that's our individual work. If you contact us and we're not able to support you in self-advocacy or just give you a tad bit of information and you need help, then that's the work we do side by side with people with disabilities. Public information and education, a little bit of what I'm doing tonight. Legislative monitoring and technical assistance. I spend a lot of time down in the Gold Dome from January to March every year, paying attention to bills that are being passed, working with and speaking to lawmakers about the effects that it's going to have on people with disabilities, and then working with attorneys to make sure that when they're supporting people with disabilities, they understand the rights that folks have. So that's a little bit about our agency, right? The way we do our work. We like to do that whenever we make a presentation, because I know I'm here tonight to talk to you about waiver services. But later in your life, or you may be thinking right now, wow, I need to call the GAO for some other type of assistance. So we like to let people know what they're doing. The bulk of what we're gonna talk about tonight, and I'm just checking the chat real quick. So I've got some 16s and some 10s for ages. That's really helpful. Thanks, Tony, for giving people a reminder as they come in to let me know ages. But what we're really going to talk about tonight is thinking about the human service system for folks with disabilities in Georgia. We'll talk about children. We'll talk about folks that are transitioning into adulthood a little bit to try to help you understand the system and how to navigate it. So where we're going to start is kind of understanding just a quick brief overview of Georgia's state departments, right? The agencies, the alphabet soup of people that are responsible for helping folks access the services and supports they need. So we have a Department of Community Health, and that is Georgia's Medicaid authority. They are responsible for administering Medicaid. They also provide licensing to providers. We're going to talk about them at several points tonight. The Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities provides services to people who experience those two disabilities, right? So you've often heard them referred to as DBHDD. The Department of Human Services is a broad umbrella. We're going to talk about them tonight, mainly in the way in which they impact Medicaid eligibility and making disability determinations, but they also provide aging services, and that's where the Division of Family and Children Services are located. The Department of Public Health has our services for really, really young folks, and of course, all the pandemic services we've been receiving from DPH right now. But mainly we'd be talking about that if there were folks with younger kids on the call, right? Babies Can't Wait and Children's Medical Services. We won't really touch on that very much tonight. And then the Department of Community Affairs, they administer the Housing Choice Voucher. Again, that's something that you can think about as you're trying to help someone transition. We're not going to touch on that a ton tonight either. But just so you get a little bit of a constellation, we are mainly going to be talking about these first three, right? Those are the agencies that we're thinking of. So DCH handles Medicaid, right? And administers those programs. DBHDD administers programs for folks with developmental disabilities and behavioral health issues. And the Department of Human Services is kind of the front door to getting Medicaid eligibility, okay? So Medicaid. We'll run through it really briefly. What I want to say about Medicaid first is that the reason that we talk about it, and we're going to talk about all the ways in which folks can be eligible, is because getting eligibility for Medicaid is how you get eligibility for the remainder of these services. Everything else I'm going to talk about tonight is predicated on the fact that folks will have Medicaid. There's kind of three pathways into that, and we'll hit on them. But this is why we spend a little bit of time talking about it. So Medicaid is a jointly funded federal and state health insurance program. Folks at DCH love that we mention it's a health insurance program. All the other services that they provide go back to that need for health insurance. The coverage is for children, people who are elderly. There's some women in there who can get special services, but then also people with disabilities of lower income who require access to healthcare services. So you got to be in one of those categories of people that Medicaid is designed to cover. We've already said it's administered by the Department of Community Health, and the determination for eligibility starts in the Division of Family and Children Services. That eligibility is based on household income and disability. So we're going to talk about both of those things as being the way in the front door, right? But you're listening about Medicaid tonight because it's the way to get to the rest of these services. I'm mostly going to leave this up here quickly so you can see that it's there, but there are several ways to apply for Medicaid. and this will come to you in your slides. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it because then we're going to talk about Peach Care and SSI and all those sorts of things. But just know this will be in your slides. Uh-oh. Somebody's got a hold to the whiteboard. Peach Care for Kids is a comprehensive healthcare program for children under 18. Folks are eligible until their 19th birthday who are uninsured and meet some poverty guidelines. It goes over what a family can earn. And it's administered by DCH, but there are other care management organizations that are out there, right? And so this is, for a lot of people, the typical way that kids would get access to Medicaid, right? Then we have this other program called the Deeming Waiver, used to be referred to, or sometimes referred to as the Katie Beckett Waiver. And the main thing to understand here is that this is a program that helps get Medicaid benefits to children who qualify as disabled, but their family income is too high, right? So unlike traditional routes to Medicaid, Peach Care, SSI, Medicaid, those sorts of things, family income matters, right? We just looked at that. There were some family income numbers here. But the Deeming Waiver doesn't include that, right? It focuses on the needs of the child so that the child can remain at home with their family and avoid institutionalization. Because for some people, if they couldn't get access to this, this form of Medicaid, their child would end up in a nursing facility or some sort of other program. And prior to the child's 18th birthday, it's a really good idea to reapply for SSI because that's going to switch. The whole rule around family income changes at that point. We'll talk a little bit about that in another second. So I want to go back for 1 second to this slide and just say that, like I told you, there were 3 pathways in, right? You can apply just based on your income, right? So that would be pretty much Peach Care for Kids, kind of the traditional route. Whenever you are found eligible for SSI, you automatically qualify for Medicaid. So if a family has sought SSI for a child with a disability, there's a determination about Medicaid included in that as well. And if someone might not qualify for those reasons because of family income, you have the option to apply for the Deeming Waiver. It doesn't matter what type of Medicaid folks are accessing when it comes to children, because the goal is to get through the door, right? Get the Medicaid so you can get the services. All right, so why? Why does this matter? Well, the biggest reason this matters is because children under 21 who are Medicaid eligible, that's why we got to get through the door, have access to the biggest array of healthcare services of any program ever, right? Because within the Medicaid Act, it says that state Medicaid programs must provide services and equipment to eligible children as prescribed by their treating physician when the service is medically necessary to correct or ameliorate that child's condition. So this says no matter what Georgia's state plan is, no matter what Georgia's Medicaid policy offers, no matter what, if a child is under the age of 21 and eligible for Medicaid, they have access to every service that their doctor says is medically necessary for them. So this is why it's important for children with disabilities, especially, to get through the front door of Medicaid, because it opens up a really, really broad array of services for folks. We always like to point out that this ameliorate word doesn't mean cure, but just means it's going to keep things from getting worse and improve upon or even maintain the best possible condition. Sometimes folks are worried about that. Like, my kid has a chronic condition, nothing's going to make it get better. Well, even if we can keep it stable, that's important. So some of the services that meet this criteria are things like therapy or skilled nursing, vision, and dental services. The services are based on the child's needs, determined by their doctor, and not by predetermined limits in the state policy, right? So it's a really robust way to get services, especially for children with disability. It can include a health check, right? So if you've applied for Medicaid, you've gotten through the door, and you have reason to believe that your child has motor or cognitive or behavioral functioning challenges that no one else has really been able to help you get access to, well, then you can get screened for that based on this law, based on EPSDT. If your child is determined to have that healthcare need, then you have to do some things. There's always some hoops to jump through. One of them is you have to get what's called a letter of medical necessity. It's just a statement from the doctor explaining certain things. We're going to go over that in a minute. And then there's some division of medical assistance paperwork that you have to fill out. And it's also, I should have put these in a different order, but durable medical equipment and assistive technology can also be covered by this service as well, right? So if your child needs something like, they mentioned orthotics or prosthetics here, or a wheelchair, or special splints, those things can be covered if they meet the criteria. Oop. So some services and equipment may require prior authorization, but that doesn't mean that they won't be covered. They must be determined to be medical in nature. So you can't get things like people say, well, my kid has asthma and it's hot in Georgia in the South, I want an air conditioner, or an air conditioner isn't medical in nature. It must be generally recognized as an acceptable medical practice or treatment. It can't be experimental or investigational. It must be related as safe and effective. The letters of medical necessity have to include all diagnoses, right? So any diagnosis that the child has, if there's a prognosis that goes along with that, the way it's expected to affect the child in the future, it should include that. This language is really important. It is being prescribed as medically necessary to correct or ameliorate, and then list what condition, right? That's super important. The doctor must tell us the amount and frequency of the service or supplies or equipment being prescribed. So the child maybe has a G-tube, how much formula, how often, those sorts of things. The duration, how long we expect this is going to happen. And it's usually between 90 and 120 days, and then things have to be reevaluated. And then the scope or intensity. So how much of this service might a child need to receive? Super important. Not everything's going to get approved on the first time. You might have to go through an appeals process. What's important to know about here is what to look for in your denial letter. It has to give you information. It has to let you know if they are requesting additional information, and it has to include the mailing address to which your appeal should be submitted. You have to appeal in writing within 30 days of receipt of the written notice, and the state has 90 days to make a final determination. This is based on requesting things like through the process of EPSDT. So that's really important that you understand those timelines in case you get denials. I also want to bring up just briefly that a broad category of services that EPSDT can help folks get access to is communication. We see people with disabilities who have spent long periods of their life in school systems and in service systems and still don't have access to really robust, meaningful communication. And that shouldn't happen to children in Georgia. They have access to be able to get screened for and get connected with alternative and augmentative communication devices. We see that as super important as a way to safeguard and prevent abuse or neglect, right? Because if something's happening to you and you can't tell anybody, or even if we see evidence of that, but you can't communicate that to people, there are plenty of times where we see law enforcement not pursuing things because a person doesn't have communication. And that is like the basement level bar, right? I wouldn't want to spend my life not being able to communicate my needs and wishes and desires, especially when there's a technology there to help me do that. And so there's more ways to get some information about augmentative communication there. The child has to be evaluated by a speech language pathologist, but you need to ask that person, are you skilled in evaluating people for communication devices? Like, do you have expertise in communication? There are plenty of SLPs out there that do really good work, but they do a lot around swallowing and tongue placement and those sorts of things. But you're looking for someone specifically related to these evaluations for communication devices. Super, super important. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. We've covered a ton around eligibility for Medicaid. I haven't been keeping up with the chat. Any questions so far? That's amazing, Amanda. I'm glad that your son's been able to get his second device through Medicaid. Keep up the good work. Don't share that with me too much, or I'll have you like on these calls with me instructing other parents, but that's really, really great. Any other questions about just eligibility for Medicaid? All right, we're just about at halfway, so I'm gonna keep rocking and rolling. So maybe we get some new questions, or can get to some questions that folks might have at the end. So all of that has been about access to Medicaid. What we are pivoting to now are home and community-based services. And these are still under that umbrella of Medicaid, but it's just a different type of service than what we've been talking about so far. So home and community-based services were created to support people to remain in their home and avoid institutionalization. So quick history lesson, we have lots and lots of laws that over the years have been moving towards folks with disability having more access to the community, right? Biggest one of, well, in recent history, the biggest one of those laws was 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? It said clearly that people had access to their community. And then in 1999, the Supreme Court went back and said, and that means that people have access to get those services in the least restrictive environment, and that there was an integration mandate that we should be moving towards integration, right? So a little bit of history there, but those two things, along with a few other laws a little bit before that, created this system that said people should be able to get the services that they need, that we often think of as medical or clinical, in their home and not in a hospital or clinical setting, right? That's what we are waiving in this topic of Medicaid waivers, right? We're waiving the requirement that this happen in an institutional or clinical setting. So we go through this whole process of creating a system where people can get home and community-based services. You have to be eligible for Medicaid. And these services can happen kind of through fee-for-service Medicaid, right? So you can use your Peach Care for Kids, right, which is fee-for-service Medicaid, to get access to some EPSDT services, which keeps kids in the communities and in their homes. Or it can be through a Medicaid waiver program. We set up a separate program that says when people qualify in certain ways, they get access to this array of services. They're available based on things like age, physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, and functional limitations. But the most important part is the goal of them, right? Which is to keep folks, especially kids, in their communities. Another thing that's just here is a bookmark for you. All of the Georgia Medicaid program manuals are on the web. This is a really important advocacy tool. So when people tell you, no, you can't have that service, right? You can get into the program manuals and search for things yourself. It's a little bit clunky, but you work at it. It gets easier to navigate. But it's important that you have this information. You can point to things in policy and ask people, well, your policy says this, tell me how, how this isn't true, right? So that's just bonus. It's a little Easter egg for you. So we offer these services for youth under the age of 22. So that means up until a person's 22nd birthday, they can receive these medically necessary services. Folks can receive skilled nursing and personal support services, autism spectrum disorder services, and intensive mental health services. These may all be different in scope, amount, and duration based on what the physician says, but those are the three things that youth under 22 can get. They get those in three ways. So GAP is the Georgia Pediatric Plan, and this is how folks get that personal support and skilled nursing service. It requires a letter of medical necessity, and they must include the number of skilled nursing hours. Sorry, that's a typo. Number of skilled nursing hours needed, or the personal support needed, and must say why the service is medically necessary, right? So that framework I gave you for letters of medical necessity would be the same for GAP. Autism services are a new plan that came into effect in January of 2018 to get Georgia better on track with providing EPSDT services. This is something we struggle to do. We as a state, really, it is sometimes hard for children to receive the services that they're supposed to. And this creation of autism services definitely made that better for a group of children. The goal of the service is to prevent the progression of autism. So if we can identify it early, kids can get treatment early, then we see some better outcomes, right? It promotes the physical and mental health of youth. So just know that those services are available. This is some of the eligibility. A diagnosis must be made by a Georgia licensed practitioner, and there's an expectation that the child is using some sort of unsafe or challenging behavior that interferes with their ability to care for themselves, their communication or social skills. And this just lists the type of evaluations that that help support the eligibility, because there's a million of these out there. So we like to give people, you could ask, right? If you feel like your child has autism and you want to get to these services when you're seeking an evaluation, you can seek providers who can provide you with the ADOS, the ADI, or the DISCO. So that's the service for autism, and then for children who experience mental health challenges. So intensive customized care coordination is for children and young adults with psychiatric disabilities who either are currently or at risk of placement in a psychiatric residential treatment facility. So children have to be between 5 and 17. Young adults can be there until their age of 21. They must meet Medicaid eligibility, and their primary diagnosis has to be psychiatric. But by participating in this program, by getting services through this program, it means that children can receive these services in their home or community setting, which includes school, right? So kids who would have been in psychiatric residential treatment facilities can get services and be at home with their families and in their school communities and still get the services and supports they need. That's just a list of some of the things that IC3 includes. Transition services, family and peer support services, supported employment, youth peer support, behavioral assistance. It's a pretty robust program. Whew. All right, so Georgia's Medicaid waivers, right? We're gonna hit these really quickly. The waivers permit Georgians who are Medicaid eligible to use their Medicaid funding to receive services at home and in the community rather than an institution. They are approved by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, and they're not transferable from state to state, right? That's an important thing to remember. If you have gotten a waiver service in Georgia, I hope you like it here, because if you move to another state, you have to go through that process again of getting the waiver service. Waiver programs require the person to meet a specific level of care in order to be deemed eligible. And that level of care is the same level of care of being in a skilled nursing facility or an intermediate care facility for folks with disabilities. So if you're trying to help someone get support and someone is telling you, well, the only way they can get that support is if they're in a nursing facility or some sort of institution for folks with disabilities, that's not true. If they meet the requirement to be in a nursing facility, they can get that same level of care and support at home and in the community. So that's an important thing to remember about that level of care. This is probably what you came tonight to hear about, right? The now and comp waivers. But it's important that we run through that information about eligibility and the services that are available to people, so you understand kind of how to get through the door. So there are 2 specific waiver services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They are referred to often as now and comp. It's the new options waiver and the comprehensive support waiver. Eligibility for this waiver is actually determined by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. And the eligibility requirements are that people have gotten Medicaid eligibility, right? So you've already been deemed eligible for Medicaid. You've been diagnosed with an intellectual disability before the age of 18, or a developmental disability or other related condition prior to the age of 22, as long as it has an intellectual impact. We are not going to get into the weeds on that. The simplest way to say that is someone could have a traumatic brain injury at 19 and it affects their cognition. That would become a developmental disability and they would qualify because they're in that window between 18 and 22. There's a few other things that fit in there, but that's the best example I can probably give you. This is a definition of developmental disabilities. It's described as a severe chronic disability that impacts a person's, that has a mental or physical impairment, is manifested before the individual turns 22, is likely to continue indefinitely, and results in substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of the following areas. So here's something that I want to say, and this isn't in the slides, but it's pretty important. If you, a couple of you have children that are 16, 17 in that transition age, and you're thinking about them receiving now comp services, you know, later in life, even in the next 5 or 10 years, You want to take advantage of the school system right now to get a diagnosis, to have eligibility that is determined before the age of 22. I can't tell you how many parents call us seeking services for their children, and for whatever reason, through the school process, that determination didn't happen in the last couple of years, or folks don't have proof of it. It is exceedingly important that in order to qualify, you are going to need that. Now, we'll help you out. And if there's an old diagnosis from when the kid was 10 or those sorts of things, we can work with that. But having a diagnosis, right? Having that diagnosis reestablished in those years right before 22, super, super important. And the other side of that is we have people that come to us later in life. They've lived at home with mom and dad forever. They didn't apply for services, but mom and dad have gotten older and they're 45 now, right? And there's no diagnosis. We don't have school records for that. Mom and dad didn't keep up with that stuff. Schools don't have it, and that makes it really challenging to help people get through the door. So I just want to, just a little bit of wisdom from the field. That diagnosis around the age of 18 to 22 is super important. Yeah,
Dana, there's a question about this specifically to clarify, and it says once they turn 22, are they ineligible for the non-comp waiver? No. But I think what you were really saying is they have to be identified as having a developmental disability before age 22. That's the critical piece. I just want to make sure that got clarified.
That is exactly right.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to share this since we've got parents that we're talking about this exact thing. Just so you guys know about Newton County's process, we only maintain records for as long as they're required under law with the state archive rules. Prior to us just destroying records, having them shredded, we do a notice in the newspaper and publicize that records will be done, and we do it basically at the time that they turn 24. So if your child has been in the school system and is about to be 24, if you'll call our office, and I'll put the number in the chat, so you can talk to Ms. Mitchell, who's our record specialist. You can certainly get a copy of your records. We'll actually give them to you instead of shredding them. We'd much rather do that than have those just go to waste. So
that's really awesome, Tony. I'm not aware of any other county that has that process, so that's really good to know. But it's just really important to gather and collect and hang on to those records, right? Because it'll be really important for people. So if you're applying right now, that's great. But if life is working pretty good and you don't feel like you need to apply right now, that's okay too. Put the records in a safe place, keep it with birth certificates or whatever else is important to you, so that down the road someone can help your child through that process. I'm gonna try to fly through this a little bit because I see some questions in the chat I want to get back to. But the other part about this, right, is we have the intellectual impact. We have the fact that it was diagnosed, it was identified before the age of 22. And then there has to be functional impairments in 3 or more areas. That's related to self-care, related to people's receptive or expressive languages, the way they learn. It's also around mobility or the ability to self-direct, right? Make my own choices, capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. So that's just a little bit about the definition. It's important to keep that in mind when you're applying for NowComp. I'm going to touch on this a little bit too. I already used it as an example. A child or youth under the age of 22 who's experienced a traumatic brain injury is considered having a developmental disability based on the impact, right? So it just goes back to all that stuff I just ran through. If you have those impacts in functional areas, then we're considering it a developmental disability. Lifelong impact of a TBI could include things like speech and language deficits, mobility, issues with learning, abilities to make decisions. And many children with TBI are often misdiagnosed as having a psychiatric disability. So that's important to just, if you're in the process of trying to get access to services, and the only diagnosis that you're getting is psychiatric, you might want to talk to people about, is it possible that this could be a TBI? Whether this is based on an injury or maybe something that happened at birth, you should look into that. So the other issue for NowComp eligibility is that whatever the developmental disability is, has to be a closely related condition to an intellectual disability and have characteristics that are similar to an intellectual disability. So there are plenty of people who have developmental disabilities, maybe something like cerebral palsy or MS, but that the characteristics of the way it impacts them doesn't have an intellectual component, and folks might not be found eligible for the now comp waiver. And they will not, DBHDD won't consider applications for people who have a primary diagnosis of a psychiatric disability. So folks can have an intellectual disability and also have a psychiatric disability, but if it's been determined that their primary diagnosis is psychiatric, then that makes it difficult to get eligibility. So that's another thing to be thinking about, especially for parents of younger children, that you want to be getting that diagnosis right. Because maybe your kid has some behavioral health concerns, but that's only ever been documented through kind of a psychiatric lens. And maybe it is a traumatic brain injury, or maybe it is a developmental disability. That can kind of be setting up evidence against them that makes now comp eligibility a bit more difficult in the future. You get to choose from kind of what they consider a menu of services. And now in comp really has to do with budget, right? So the now waiver is a little bit smaller. The budget caps at about $40,000. It doesn't include a residential component. So these are people who are receiving services, maybe limited services in their own home or with mom and dad, or maybe I'm getting some supported employment services and someone who comes out and helps me get some access to my community. Comp is for people who require a fuller range of intensive services, and it includes the residential option. So these would be things like, group living arrangements or those sorts of things. The comp waiver also will have exceptions for people who might need more of a certain service, right? So that's an important thing to recognize. Applications are online at the website there. There's also a new portal called IDD Connects. So if you have never applied for now comp services and you're starting this process, you can start the process fully online. You can upload your assessments. You can get information back from them. It's supposed to be a more streamlined process. They are working to convert older applications, but if you applied before, you're still kind of in the regular process. There are 6 DBHDD regional field offices. Those are the places that are supposed to have kind of supports for people who are accessing services in that region. And when you get the slides, you can go to the links there to see your regional field offices. Once you apply for services, you should be connected with what's called their intake and evaluation team. And so that's the person that you'd be contacting to say, hey, I got a new assessment, or I have a new question, or so on and so forth, to get you through the application. Once you're determined to be eligible, determinations for services. So there's eligibility, and then there's actually services. And determination for services is based on most in need status. So if you apply and you're eligible, but you're not determined to be most in need, then you're on what they call a planning list. And that just means they're assessing people every time services are available to determine who's most in need and is going to get the next service that's available. And once that happens, then you'd be connected to what's called a planning list administrator. That's the person that you should be contacting with changes and with questions. If anybody here has already applied for now comp services and you're on the planning list, I'll tell you, like I tell everyone, it's a system where the squeaky wheel is really going to get the oil, right? So you want to be in close contact with your planning list administrator. You want to be keeping that person updated about changes that would make the person that you're standing beside be considered for most in need. That's really important. Another list of services, that is a much longer list, but this is kind of a summary. So supported employment and pre-vocational, behavior support, specialized medical equipment, community access services, so ways for people to get involved in their community, nursing support, and support coordination. So support coordination and the residential piece is only available, support coordination is available in both, but the residential piece is only available in comp. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to get us to the end. There are several other waiver programs. What I want to tell you about them is, the main thing about them is you can be receiving one waiver service while on the waiting list for another waiver service, right? So if you meet the eligibility for both now comp and ICWP, which that's possible, ICWP has a smaller list of services, but it also has a smaller waiting list for those services. So there are some times where people are able to help folks or able themselves to get through the process of getting ICWP, Independent Care Waiver Program services, while they are on the planning list for NowComp, right? And so it's not going to cover everything that you would be seeking from NowComp, but it might hit some of those high points. So I'm going to say that the only eligibility is that you're Medicaid eligible, or they will help you get Medicaid eligible. You must be between 21 and 64, and you must be at risk of nursing facility placement because you can't get services in your community. So if someone needs personal care support, right, and they're between those ages, and them not being able to take care of themselves would make the case that they'd go to a nursing facility, you get that service while you're waiting for NowComp. The community care service program is really similar, but it is more about people who are aging or experience a different type of disability. It also has to have the same level of care for admission to a nursing facility, and the person must be Medicaid eligible. The thing I didn't point out with ICWP is that it's a physical impairment or a traumatic brain injury, right? And CCSP can be aging or another type of disability like a seizure disorder, right? Which wouldn't be physical, so you wouldn't get ICWP. But same thing applies. You can be receiving CCSP services while you're on the planning list for another waiver. All I'm going to say about this is really, really briefly, it's important that we're talking to our elected officials about what our community needs, right? This may feel daunting to you. Going down to the Gold Dome isn't for everybody, but those folks are also just human and they don't know what they don't know. There's plenty of ways to do this through writing, making phone calls. And I always like to mention that to people. So if you're thinking, my kid has needs that are not being met, or we've been on the planning list for too long, legislative advocacy can be important to moving that needle. There's a sample letter that's in the packet. I also want to mention that it's budget season right now. So the end of the year is when the governor's office is working on putting together their budget proposals that will be presented to the legislature in January. This is an amazing time for advocacy for two reasons. It's budget season. They're thinking about it right now. They're talking about it right now. But also, Georgia is flush with cash right this moment. You may not be seeing that. It may not seem like it's true in your communities, but it is true. We have about $2.2 billion in revenue that we need to spend before the beginning of the next fiscal year. So from right now to next June, there's $2.2 billion that have to go somewhere. And if we're not being loud and we're not being the squeaky wheel, I can guarantee you it's not going to people with disabilities, right? So if you learned something tonight or you want to learn a little bit more, you can always hop into the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. Their link comes up a little bit later that will tell you about some advocacy opportunities. But there's a lot of federal money flowing into Georgia right now related to the COVID pandemic. There's also $4.3 billion in what we like to call the rainy day fund. I would maintain that for some people in Georgia, it's a rainy day, right? And so if you can think of needs in your community, this is a good time to be talking to the legislature about it. We have a lot of access to do some things for people, and the excuse that we don't have money just isn't true right now. All right, so there's a sample letter that'll be in your packet, and then these are some other resources, and we made it to the finish line. So thank you all for sticking with me tonight. I know that that's like drinking water from a fire hose.